What if I told you there's a book that begins with an 80-year-old woman literally burying herself alive, only to emerge transformed and ready to cross international borders in search of her past? A book that won the International Booker Prize, became the first Hindi novel ever translated to receive this honor, and challenges everything we think we know about aging, identity, and the stories we tell ourselves about home. Hi, I'm Ridhima. Welcome to The Old Trunk. Today we're exploring Geetanjali Shree's Tomb of Sand, or Ret Samadhi in its original text Hindi. This book has been sitting on my TBR pile for months, and after finally experiencing this literary masterpiece, I understand why it's being hailed as one of the most important contemporary works from the Indian subcontinent. Before we begin, I want to share something special about my reading experience. Since Hindi is one of my mother tongues, I had the privilege of reading both the original Ret Samadhi and Daisy Rockwell's English translation, Tomb of Sand. This dual reading experience gave me unique insights into how Shree's innovative prose works in Hindi and how brilliantly Rockwell has preserved both meaning and experimental style in English. Published in Hindi in 2018 as Ret Samadhi, this novel represents something revolutionary in how we discuss Indian literature on the global stage. For too long, Indian writing in English has dominated international conversations about Indian literature. But Shree's work, originally written in Hindi, challenges this linguistic hierarchy. Geetanjali Shree isn't a newcomer to the literary scene. She's been writing for decades, with several acclaimed works in Hindi, but Tomb of Sand marks her international breakthrough. The fact that this book won the International Booker Prize in 2022 isn't just a personal triumph for Shree. It's a watershed moment for literature in Hindi and other Indian languages. This book's title itself is layered with meaning. Ret Samadhi literally translates to a tomb or grave made of sand. Something impermanent, shifting, always changing. This metaphor runs through the entire narrative, reflecting how memory, identity, and even national borders are more fluid than we often acknowledge. This is a book that emerges from the soil of partition literature but grows into something entirely contemporary. It's not bound by the traditional expectations of how partition should be discussed in Indian literature. Instead, she creates something that feels both deeply rooted in subcontinental experience and universally resonant. Let's get started with what Tomb of Sand is all about. It opens with an extraordinary image. An 80-year-old woman who has taken to her bed, essentially burying herself alive in grief and stubbornness. But this isn't a story about dying. It's about the possibility of rebirth at any age. Our protagonist, who we come to know as Ma, has recently lost her husband and seems determined to waste away in her bed. Her adult daughter desperately tries various strategies to bring her back to life, while Ma's relationship with her son reveals the complex dynamics of family expectations and disappointments. But then something shifts. Ma emerges from her self-imposed tomb not as the same person who entered it, but transformed. She becomes curious about the world again, starts asserting her independence, and eventually embarks on a journey that takes her across the border between India and Pakistan. A journey that forces her to confront not just her personal past, but the larger historical trauma of partition. What makes this plot structure so compelling is how Shree weaves together the intimate and the political. This isn't just a story about an elderly woman's late life awakening, nor is it simply another partition narrative. It's something more complex, a meditation on how personal healing and historical reckoning can happen simultaneously. The story moves between different time periods and perspectives, creating a narrative that feels like memory itself. Non-linear, associative, sometimes unreliable, but always emotionally true. We encounter multiple generations of women, each dealing with their own versions of displacement, loss, and the search for belonging. Without giving away anything, I can tell you that this journey becomes both literal and metaphorical. Ma's physical crossing of borders mirrors an internal journey through the landscapes of memory, trauma, and possibility. The book asks profound questions. Is it ever too late to reclaim your story? Can we heal from historical wounds that predate our own birth? What does it mean to call a place a home when that place has been divided by lines drawn on maps? Okay, now let's get into the soul of the novel, its characters. Ma is one of the most complex elderly protagonists I've encountered in contemporary literature. She refuses to romanticize or patronize her. She's not the wise grandmother figure we might expect from traditional narratives. Instead, she's stubborn, difficult, sometimes selfish, and absolutely real. What makes Ma fascinating is how she embodies the tension of her generation. She lives through partition, independence, decades of social change and personal losses that would break many people. Her initial retreat into bed isn't just grief, it's a form of resistance against a world that has repeatedly told her that her story doesn't matter. But Ma's transformation isn't sudden or miraculous. She shows us a woman slowly reclaiming her agency. Her journey from passivity to action feels earned because we see the internal work happening alongside the external changes. Ma's relationship with her own desires for adventure, for understanding, for closure develops throughout the narrative in ways that feel psychologically authentic. The way Ma navigates her children's expectations while pursuing her own needs creates some of the book's most compelling tensions. She's not trying to be a good mother or grandmother in conventional terms. She's trying to figure out who she is beyond those roles. Moving on, the second important character, Ma's daughter, represents the sandwich generation, caught between caring for an aging parent and managing her own adult responsibilities. She doesn't make her a saint or a villain. She's simply a woman trying to do right by her family while maintaining her sanity. The daughter's frustration with Ma's behavior feels completely understandable. Even when we sympathize with Ma's need for independence, their relationship explores the complex dynamics of care, control, and love between adult children and their parents. The daughter wants to help, but her version of help often involves limiting Ma's freedom, a tension that will resonate with anyone who has navigated these family dynamics. What I appreciate about this character is how Shree allows her to have her own arc. She's not just a supporting character in Ma's story. She's dealing with her own questions about identity, responsibility, and what it means to honor your parents while honoring yourself. The third important character of the novel is the son. The son's relationship with Ma reveals different aspects of family expectations and disappointment. Without spoiling the specifics, I can say that this character represents certain masculine expectations about success, family duty, and emotional expression that create distance between him and his mother. She uses this relationship to explore how gender shapes family dynamics and how different children can have radically different relationships with the same parent. The son struggles with his own sense of purpose and achievement, create a parallel narrative about what it means to live up to parental expectations. Moving on to one of the most memorable characters in the book, Rosie, a transgender who becomes important to Ma's journey. Shree's portrayal of this character is nuanced and respectful, avoiding both fetishization and oversimplification. Rosie represents themes of gender fluidity, social marginalization, and chosen family that run throughout the book. Her interactions with Ma create some of the most touching moments in the narrative, as both characters recognize in each other a kind of outsider status that creates unexpected bonds. Through Rosie, Shree explores how society treats those who don't fit into conventional categories, whether it's gender nonconformity or age inappropriate behavior. Both Ma and Rosie are, in different ways, refusing to stay in their assigned boxes. The book is populated with ancestral figures, some real, some imagined, who represent the weight of history on individual lives. These characters don't function as traditional characters so much as voices from the past that inform the present narrative. Shree's handling of historical trauma through these figures is particularly skillful. Rather than making partition the center of the narrative, she shows how historical events can continue to reverberate through generations in unexpected ways. Geetanjali Shree's writing style in Tomb of Sand is unlike anything I've encountered in contemporary literature. Reading both versions of this book was a revelation. In the original Hindi, Shree's wordplay, her experiments with syntax, and her cultural references have a different texture and rhythm. There are moments where Hindi idioms and cultural concepts are embedded so naturally that they create layers of meaning that don't always translate directly. For instance, the title Ret Samadhi carries specific cultural and spiritual connotations in Hindi that Tomb of Sand captures conceptually but not culturally. Samadhi isn't just a tomb, it's a meditative state, a spiritual absorption often associated with the final resting place of saints and spiritual masters. This adds a dimension to Ma's journey that Hindi readers experience differently. What impressed me most was how Rockwell's translation maintains the experimental nature of Shree's prose. The stream of consciousness passages, the playful disruptions of chronology, the switching between different registers of language, all of this comes through beautifully in English. However, reading in Hindi allowed me to appreciate Shree's specific innovations within Hindi literary traditions. The narrative moves like memory itself, associative, non-linear, sometimes contradictory. Shree doesn't recognize the story in chronological order or even in clearly defined chapters. Instead, the book flows between different time periods, perspectives, and levels of reality in ways that mirror how our minds actually work when we're trying to process complex experiences. This isn't stream of consciousness in the Joyce or Woolf tradition, but something distinctly contemporary and subcontinental. Shree captures the way stories get passed down through generations, how they change in the telling, how different family members remember events differently, how collective trauma becomes personal memory. The book operates in a space between realism and magic that feels particularly suited to its themes. When Ma emerges from her bed, tomb transformed, it's both psychologically realistic and metaphorically powerful. She doesn't ask us to believe in literal magic, but she does ask us to accept that transformation can feel magical. The sand imagery that gives the book its title appears throughout in various forms, sometimes literal sand, sometimes metaphorical references to impermanence, sometimes as a representation of how borders and identities shift over time. This consistent metaphorical language creates a dreamlike quality that never feels forced or pretentious. Having read both the Hindi original and English translation, I can speak to the remarkable achievement Rockwell has accomplished. Some of Shree's wordplay in Hindi is untranslatable. There are puns, cultural references, and linguistic experiments that work specifically in Hindi. Yet, Rockwell finds creative ways to preserve the spirit of these innovations even when the literal translation is impossible. In the Hindi version, Shree plays with different dialects and registers. Formal literary Hindi, colloquial expressions, even some Urdu phrases that reflect the cultural mixing of the subcontinent. Rockwell handles this linguistic diversity by retaining some Hindi words where translation would lose essential meaning, while finding English equivalents that maintain the tonal shifts. What struck me most was how both versions feel complete in themselves. The Hindi Ret Samadhi and the English Tomb of Sand are like sister works, related but distinct, each beautiful in their own linguistic context. The book also plays with different registers of language, formal and informal, ancient and contemporary, poetic and conversational. This linguistic diversity reflects the complexity of Indian multilingual experience and adds layers of meaning that reward careful readers. One of the most interesting aspects of Shree's technique is how she handles narrative voice. The story is told from multiple perspectives, but the transitions between viewpoints are fluid rather than clearly marked. Sometimes we're in Ma's consciousness, sometimes in her daughter's, sometimes in a more omniscient narrative voice that seems to represent collective memory. This approach creates an immersive reading experience that can be challenging but is ultimately rewarding. You have to pay attention as a reader, but the payoff is a deeper understanding of how individual stories connect to larger historical and social narratives. The book's structure mirrors its themes of impermanence and transformation. Just when you think you understand the narrative pattern, Shree shifts approach. The pacing varies dramatically. Sometimes meditative and slow, sometimes urgent and fast moving. This structural experimentation serves the story rather than calling attention to itself. The varying rhythms reflect the different phases of Ma's journey and the different time periods the narrative explores. This book challenges ageist assumptions about what's possible in later life. Ma's journey suggests that radical transformation doesn't have to happen only in youth. The book asks us to reconsider our cultural narratives about aging, dependence, and the supposed wisdom that comes with age. Shree doesn't romanticize aging, but she also refuses to see it as simply decline. Ma's physical limitations are real, but they don't define the scope of her possibilities. Her late life rebellion against family expectations and social norms feels both comic and profound. The theme of aging intersects with gender in complex ways. Ma's newfound assertiveness challenges not just age related expectations but also cultural norms about how women, particularly elderly women, should behave. Her refusal to be a conventional grandmother figure creates tension but also opens up new possibilities for self definition. The book also explores how historical events, particularly partition, continue to shape individual lives decades later. But Shree's approach to historical trauma is subtle rather than didactic. She shows us how the past lives in the present without making the book a traditional historical novel. Ma's journey across borders becomes a way of confronting not just personal memories but collective memories. The book suggests that individual healing and historical reckoning can happen simultaneously, that personal journeys can also be political acts. The treatment of memory in the book is particularly sophisticated. She shows us how memories can be both unreliable and essential, how different people can remember the same events completely differently, how family stories get passed down and transformed through generations. The physical border between India and Pakistan becomes a metaphor for all kinds of boundaries between past and present, self and other, life and death. Mass crossing of this border is both literally dangerous and metaphorically necessary. Shree explores how arbitrary political borders can become psychologically real, how they can separate families and communities that share culture, language, and history. But she also suggests that these borders are more porous than they appear, that human connections can transcend political divisions. The theme of belonging extends beyond national identity to include questions of family belonging, gender belonging, and age related belonging. Multiple characters in the book are trying to figure out where they fit in a world that seems to have rigid categories for everything. Through characters like Rosie and Ma herself, the book explores themes of gender fluidity and identity transformation. Ma's late life rebellion includes rejecting conventional feminine roles, while Rosie represents a different kind of gender nonconformity. Shree's treatment of these themes is intersectional. She shows how age, class, and social position affect how gender nonconformity is received and understood. Ma's behavior is seen as eccentric because of her age and class position. Rosie faces different kinds of social marginalization. The book suggests that identity itself is more fluid than social categories would have us believe, that transformation is always possible even when it's socially discouraged. The relationships between Ma, her children, and other family members explore how families negotiate change, responsibility, and love across generations. The book doesn't idealize family relationships, but shows them as complex negotiations between competing needs and desires. The intergenerational trauma related to partition adds layers to these family dynamics. Different generations have different relationships to historical events and different strategies for dealing with inherited trauma. Shree also explores how family roles can become prisons, how being a good mother or dutiful daughter can limit individual growth and self expression. Ma's journey partly involves rejecting these limiting roles in favor of a more complex understanding of love and responsibility. Reading Tomb of Sand was one of those rare experiences where I felt like I was encountering something genuinely new in literature. This isn't just because the book won the International Booker Prize or because it represents an important moment for Hindi literature on the global stage, though both of those things matter. It's because Shree has created something that feels both deeply specific to subcontinental experience and universally resonant. What struck me most powerfully was how the book handles the relationship between the political and the personal. So much contemporary literature either focuses entirely on individual psychology or tries to tackle big social issues in ways that feel didactic. Shree manages to do both simultaneously without sacrificing either the intimacy of personal story or the weight of historical significance. Ma's journey resonated with me on multiple levels. As someone who has watched elderly family members navigate questions of independence and care, I recognize the authenticity of those family dynamics. But the book also made me think differently about aging and possibility. In a culture that often sees old age as simply a decline from productive adulthood, Ma's story suggests that the later decades of life can be a time of radical transformation and self discovery. The experimental narrative structure initially challenged me as a reader, but it ultimately deepened my engagement with the story. Shree's nonlinear approach mirrors how we actually experience memory and trauma, not as neat chronological sequences but as layered, interconnected experiences that inform each other across time. I was particularly moved by how the book treats the theme of late life rebellion. Ma's refusal to be a conventional elderly woman isn't portrayed as simply admirable or simply selfish. It's complex, with real consequences for her relationships and her family. This complexity makes her transformation feel earned rather than sentimental. What I found most impressive about Shree's writing was how she managed to be experimental without being inaccessible. The book challenges readers, but never in ways that feel arbitrary or show-offy. Every narrative choice serves the larger themes and emotional arc of the story. Having the privilege of reading both versions also made me deeply aware of the politics of literary recognition that I mentioned earlier. The original Hindi text has been available since 2018, but it needed English translation to reach global audiences and win international recognition. This isn't a criticism of the translation or the prize. Both are wonderful achievements. Rather, it highlights how language can determine literary visibility on the world stage. Reading in Hindi first actually enhanced my appreciation for the translation. I could see the specific choices Rockwell made, the creative solutions she found for untranslatable elements, the way she maintained Shree's experimental spirit while making the text accessible to English readers. It's a reminder that great translation is itself a creative art form. The book also made me think about the stories we tell about partition and historical trauma more broadly. Instead of treating these as distant historical events, Shree shows how they continue to shape individual lives in unexpected ways. This feels particularly relevant in our current global moment, when we're dealing with multiple forms of historical reckoning and inherited trauma. This is a book that will reward multiple readings. The layered narrative structure means that returning readers will discover new connections and meanings. It's also a book that benefits from discussion, the kind of story that makes you want to immediately find someone else who has read it so you can talk through its complexities. The book succeeds on multiple levels as a family drama, as a meditation on aging and possibility, as an exploration of historical trauma, and as an innovative work of literary art. It manages to be both entertaining and profound, both culturally specific and universally relevant. If I have any criticism, it's that the experimental structure occasionally feels challenging in ways that might frustrate some readers. But I'd argue that this challenge is part of the book's power. It asks us to read actively and thoughtfully, to engage with the text rather than simply consuming it. The book also raises important questions about whose stories get told and how they get told. Ma's story matters partly because it's a kind of story that often gets ignored. An elderly woman's late life transformation isn't typically as worthy of serious literary attention. Shree's treatment of this story suggests that we need to expand our understanding of what kinds of narratives deserve our attention. This is literature at its best: challenging, moving, innovative, and ultimately transformative for the reader. It's a kind of book that changes how you think about aging, family, memory, and possibility. It's also a beautiful example of how literature can bridge cultural and linguistic divides while remaining true to its specific cultural context. This book will particularly appeal to readers who love experimental literature, are interested in intergenerational family dynamics, want to engage with global literature, are curious about age and late life stories, and appreciate literary fiction that tackles historical themes. However, this book might not be ideal if you prefer straightforward linear narratives, action driven plots, clear genre conventions, and love quick light reading. The experimental structure and meditative pacing require patience and active engagement from readers. But for those willing to invest in reading experience, the rewards are substantial. If this review has intrigued you, I highly recommend adding Tomb of Sand to your pile, just like I had it on mine for far too long before finally diving in. This is a book that benefits from being discussed, so I'd love to hear your thoughts if you decide to read it. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and press that bell icon so that you get notified of whenever I upload a new video. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay happy. Thanks for watching. Lots of love. Bye-bye.